The air inside the community hall carried the scent of old books and polished wooden floors, mingling with the soft hum of quiet conversations. Outside, the fading sun cast golden streaks through the stained glass windows, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. It was one of those late afternoons where time itself seemed to stretch, holding everything in a delicate, tranquil balance. Karoline Leavitt stood near the stage, adjusting the microphone stand absent-mindedly as she scanned the room. The event had drawn a modest crowd: parents, retirees, and the occasional student scribbling notes in well-worn journals. It wasn't the grandeur of a political rally or the rush of a televised debate, but that was precisely why she liked these settings. Here, people listened not for spectacle, but for substance. She took a slow breath, grounding herself before she spoke. The room quieted, an expectant hush settling over the audience. She had spoken in halls grander than this one, but something about today felt different. It wasn't the setting, nor the audience. It was the weight of the moment, the sense that something unseen yet significant loomed just beneath the surface. As she began to address the crowd, her voice carried a steady warmth, weaving through topics of perseverance, integrity, and the quiet resilience that often goes unnoticed in a world obsessed with noise. She spoke of the struggles people faced, not just in policy discussions, but in their kitchens, their workplaces, and their hearts. She wasn't here to make promises of sweeping change or grand reforms. She was here to remind people that hope often resided in the smallest of gestures, in the spaces between words. And then, the moment arrived. A small figure shifted in the second row, hesitant but determined. The child couldn't have been older than 8, her tiny frame almost swallowed by the oversized church pew. Wisps of golden hair framed her face, her hands clutched tightly around the spine of a well-worn book, a Bible, its edges softened by time and use. Her feet barely grazed the floor as she straightened her posture, her wide eyes locked onto Karoline with an intensity far beyond her years. The girl's mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a silent encouragement that was neither a push nor a restraint. The girl swallowed, her small throat bobbing as she lifted her voice, quiet but unwavering. "What does God mean to you?" The question arrived like a whisper in a canyon, deceptively soft but carrying immeasurable depth. It did not just land in the room. It settled in the space between heartbeats, in the breathless moment before an answer could take shape. The crowd stirred, a murmur rippling through them like the first tremor before an earthquake. It was the kind of question that did not lend itself to rehearsed responses or carefully curated words. It demanded sincerity, stripped of politics, unguarded and raw. Karoline did not answer right away. She let the words linger, feeling them press against the walls of her own convictions, demanding to be examined. There were answers that would be easy, ones that would earn nods of approval, but something within her resisted the temptation to reach for the familiar. She looked at the child, not at the audience, not at the rows of expectant faces, but the small girl who had dared to ask something so simple and yet so impossibly profound. The weight of her own memories pressed against her chest. She thought of the nights when faith had been the only thing keeping her upright, the moments where doubt had gnawed at the edges of belief, and the quiet, unseen instances where she had pleaded for answers in the silence of her own mind. A single tear welled in the corner of the child's eye, though she did not appear to be crying. It was something deeper than sadness, an ache, a yearning, a need for an answer that was more than words. Karoline knew, then, that whatever she said next would matter in a way few words ever truly did. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, and then she spoke. A hush settled over the room, thick and heavy, as if the very walls of the hall leaned in to listen. The weight of expectation pressed against Karoline's chest, not in a way that suffocated, but in a way that demanded complete honesty. The child's question had unraveled something deep inside her, something that could not be neatly folded back into place with a carefully crafted response. She could feel the eyes of the audience tracing the outline of her hesitation, watching as she gathered her thoughts with meticulous care. This was not the moment for political eloquence, for well-rehearsed lines that danced effortlessly around deep truths without ever truly touching them. This was the moment to speak from the part of her that still whispered prayers in the quiet hours of the night, when the world was too tired to pretend certainty existed. Karoline took a slow breath, her gaze locking onto the young girl's tear-bright eyes, the reflection of something sacred shimmering just beneath their surface. "I used to think faith was about knowing," she said finally, her voice a measured cadence of contemplation. "I thought it meant having answers, having certainty, having a path laid out so clearly that you could never get lost. I believed that if I did everything right, if I followed every rule, if I prayed the right way, then God would always be near." A flicker of recognition passed over the child's face, a silent acknowledgement that this was a familiar belief, one she had held close. Karoline allowed the pause to settle before continuing, her voice soft but unshaken. "But life has a way of unraveling even the strongest certainties. It has a way of asking questions that don't have answers, of placing you in moments where no prayer feels strong enough to pull you through. And in those moments, I did not feel God's presence the way I thought I should." The girl blinked, her small hands gripping the worn leather of her Bible a little tighter, as if bracing for something she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "But here's what I have come to understand," Karoline continued, her voice weaving through the stillness like a thread through fabric. "Faith isn't about always knowing. It isn't about never doubting, never falling, never feeling lost. It's about believing that even in the silence, even in the unanswered prayers, even in the moments where you cannot feel Him, He is still there." A murmur stirred through the audience, the sound of shifting seats, of quiet sighs, of people who had spent years searching for the reassurance she had just spoken aloud. She let the words breathe before she spoke again, allowing the weight of them to settle. "God, to me, is not the absence of struggle, nor is He the promise of an easy road. He is the whisper in the chaos, the quiet presence in the loneliness, the gentle hand that steadies even when we don't realize we're being held." The young girl exhaled, the single tear that had clung to the edge of her lashes finally breaking free and trailing down her cheek. But it was not the tear of sadness, nor the tear of a child overwhelmed. It was something else entirely. It was the release of something long held, the unraveling of a question that had weighed upon her small shoulders for far too long. Karoline's voice softened even further, almost a whisper now, though it carried through the hall with the force of something undeniable. "You don't have to understand everything to believe, sweetheart. You don't have to have all the answers to trust that you are not alone." The child's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, the weight of understanding settling into her bones in a way that no sermon, no doctrine, no carefully recited scripture had ever managed before. And in that moment, something in the room shifted. It was as if a collective exhale passed through the audience, as if hearts that had been carrying quiet doubts for years had finally found a place to set them down. No one clapped, no one spoke, no one moved. For a brief, fleeting moment, faith was not something distant, something debated, something tangled in questions that never found their way to answers. It was here, in the breath between words, in the quiet gaze of a child who had found peace in the simplest of truths. And Karoline, standing there in the center of it all, felt something inside her shift as well. Because in answering the child, she had found an answer for herself. The silence that filled the room did not feel empty or uncomfortable. Rather, it felt as though something sacred had settled among them. There was a depth to the stillness, an invisible presence pressing gently against the air, reminding everyone that some moments were meant to be felt rather than explained. Karoline stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with the quiet realization that something beyond her control had just unfolded. The child's tear-streaked face had not changed much in expression, but her eyes carried a different weight now, as if the world had shifted ever so slightly on its axis. She no longer clutched the Bible as tightly, no longer sat with shoulders hunched as though bracing for an answer that might disappoint her. Instead, she exhaled, slow and measured, as if she had just placed down something heavy she had been carrying for far too long. Karoline wanted to say more, to add something profound, to leave the child with words she could carry beyond this moment. But the more she searched for something meaningful, the more she realized that no grand statement could improve upon what had already been said. Some truths needed no embellishment, no reinforcement, no repetition. They simply existed, waiting to be acknowledged. Instead, Karoline turned her gaze toward the rest of the room, sensing the weight of many unspoken questions lingering in the spaces between people. There was a shift in their posture, a quiet unraveling of the usual masks worn in public. A mother in the back wiped her cheek absently, as if surprised by her own reaction. An older man near the entrance nodded to himself, lips pressed together, his weathered hands folded over his lap as though he were holding something precious but invisible. She had spent so much of her life crafting messages, shaping words to fit the expectations of audiences, ensuring every speech landed precisely where it was meant to. Yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. There was no strategy, no political calculus, no measured attempt at persuasion. There was only the raw, unvarnished reality that faith, true faith, was not about certainty, but about choosing to believe even in the absence of it. A shift in movement caught her eye, and she noticed the girl's mother reaching for her daughter's hand, squeezing it with the kind of reassurance only a parent could give. There was something unspoken in that grip, something that transcended mere comfort. It was recognition, a shared understanding between generations, a moment where an unspoken question that had once belonged to the mother now belonged to the child. Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of witnessing something so profoundly human. She had spent years standing behind podiums, engaging in debates, pushing forward ideas she believed in with unrelenting passion. But never had she felt the gravity of her own words as she did now, standing before an audience that had come expecting a speech, only to be confronted with something far more intimate. She had not planned for this. She had not anticipated this shift, this moment of connection, this sudden awareness that truth, when spoken plainly, without pretense or performance, had the power to reach places no carefully structured argument ever could. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was softer than before, yet carried through the room with a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. "Faith," she said, letting the words settle before continuing, "isn't a shield that protects us from hardship. It doesn't keep us from experiencing pain, doubt, or fear. But it is what carries us through those moments, even when we don't understand how." The girl's small fingers tightened around her mother's hand, her wide eyes never leaving Karoline's. "In the darkest moments of my life," Karoline continued, her voice unwavering, "I have questioned, I have struggled, I have wondered if God was listening. But looking back, I have come to understand that faith was never about receiving immediate answers. It was about trusting that even in silence, I was never truly alone." A murmur rippled through the audience, not of discomfort, but of something deeper: recognition, reflection, the quiet unraveling of doubts that had been carried in secret for years. Karoline let the moment linger, let the weight of her words settle into the spaces they needed to reach. She wasn't here to change minds. She wasn't here to convince anyone of anything. She was simply here to tell the truth. And in that truth, she had found something she hadn't realized she had been searching for all along. The weight of the room had not lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier, though not in a way that felt burdensome. It was the kind of weight that came from revelation, from the unspoken recognition that something deeply personal had unfolded before them all. Karoline stood in the center of it, no longer feeling like a speaker at a podium, but rather like a witness to something far greater than herself. She had expected to stand before this audience and share insights about leadership, perseverance, and the values that shaped her convictions. She had anticipated polite nods, murmurs of agreement, perhaps even a few thoughtful questions about policy or the future. Instead, she had found herself answering something that cut deeper than politics, something that reached into the very fabric of what it meant to be human. Her words had been simple, yet they had carried a weight she had not anticipated. And now, in the stillness that followed, she could feel the ripple effect of that truth settling into the hearts of those who had heard it. The child in the second row had not shifted much, yet there was something different in her posture now. Her shoulders, once hunched with the weight of an unspoken question, had relaxed ever so slightly. Her small hands, which had gripped the leather-bound Bible as though it might somehow contain the answer she sought, now rested more gently in her lap. Karoline could see it in her face, the quiet, unspoken understanding that had not been there before. This was not the kind of answer that erased every doubt, nor was it the kind that provided a perfect roadmap for the questions that would inevitably come, but had done something more important. It had given the child permission to believe, even in the absence of certainty. The audience remained still, caught in the tension between reflection and emotion. It was as if they, too, had been drawn into this moment, their own silent questions resurfacing in the wake of the child's courage. Some looked down, hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. Others simply watched, their eyes reflecting something unspoken, something that had lingered beneath the surface of their own lives for longer than they cared to admit. Karoline knew that what she said next mattered. Not in the way a political speech mattered, not in the way carefully chosen words could sway an argument or win favor. It mattered because the truth, once spoken aloud, carried a responsibility. It could not simply be left there, hanging in the air like an echo that would soon fade. It had to be honored. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before she continued. "I have met people from every walk of life," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "And if there is one thing I have learned, it is that doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is a part of it." A murmur of understanding rippled through the room, as if the words had struck a chord that resonated far beyond this moment. "The strongest faith I have ever witnessed," she continued, "does not come from those who have never questioned, never struggled, never wondered why their prayers seemed to go unanswered. It comes from those who have faced the silence and still chosen to believe. It comes from those who have stood in the darkness and decided to keep walking forward, even when they could not see the path ahead." She let her words settle, watching as the truth of them took hold. Faith was not about having every answer. It was not about certainty. It was about trust, the kind of trust that endured even when everything else felt uncertain. She shifted her gaze back to the child, whose eyes had not wavered from hers, as if she were holding onto every word, drawing from them something she had needed more than anything else. "You asked me what God means to me," Karoline said, her voice softening. "And the best answer I can give you is this. He is the presence that remains even when we do not understand. He is the quiet reassurance that we are never truly alone, even when we feel like we are." A single tear traced a path down the child's cheek, though she did not wipe it away. There was no shame in it, no embarrassment, only the quiet surrender to something she had carried in her heart for so long. And then, something unexpected happened. A man in the back of the room, older, his face lined with the weight of years lived and battles fought in silence, let out a slow, unsteady breath. His hands, rough and calloused, pressed together, not in applause, but in something deeper, something that felt like reverence. A woman near the front, who had been sitting with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, loosened her grip, her fingers tracing absent patterns against the fabric of her sleeve, as though she, too, had found something in this moment she had not expected. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if they all knew that something sacred had unfolded in their midst, something that could not be undone or ignored. Karoline felt the shift in the air, the unspoken understanding that filled the room like the final note of a hymn that had yet to fade. She had come here expecting to give a speech. Instead, she had been given the privilege of witnessing something far greater than words. And as she looked at the child, whose question had started it all, she realized something profound. This moment was not about her. It was not about politics or eloquence or the art of public speaking. It was about the power of a single, honest question, and the even greater power of an answer spoken from the heart. The weight of the moment did not pass quickly, nor did it dissolve into the usual rhythm of polite applause or quiet acknowledgments. Instead, it remained, suspended in the space between breaths, stretching across the room like a thread of something unseen yet deeply felt. It was as though no one wanted to be the first to disturb what had just unfolded, a collective understanding that, for once, words had not been wielded as mere statements, but as something sacred. Karoline let the silence breathe, resisting the instinct to fill it with anything more. She had learned, over years of speaking before crowds both large and small, that there were moments where even the most carefully chosen words could only diminish what had already been said. Some truths were meant to be carried in the quiet, left to settle into the spaces of the heart that needed them most. The young girl who had asked the question still sat with her hands resting lightly over the Bible in her lap, her gaze unwavering. The tear that had traced its path down her cheek had long since dried, yet its presence lingered in the soft openness of her expression. There was no longer the tension of anticipation, no longer the tight grip of unspoken uncertainty. Instead, there was something else, something lighter, something that carried the quiet strength of a soul that had been given permission to wonder without fear. Karoline took a slow, steady breath, allowing herself to absorb the moment before she spoke again. "Faith is not about having every answer," she said, her voice quieter now, though it carried through the hall with an undeniable weight. "It is about choosing to trust, even when the answers remain unseen." The girl's small fingers traced the edge of the worn leather binding, her eyes shining with something that Karoline could only describe as understanding. Not the kind of understanding that came from knowledge or doctrine, but the kind that was felt deep, unshaken, and quiet in its certainty. A shift moved through the room, subtle yet undeniable. Some nodded in quiet agreement, while others sat motionless, their expressions caught somewhere between contemplation and revelation. An older woman near the back dabbed at the corner of her eye with the edge of a neatly folded handkerchief, as if surprised by the emotion that had surfaced. A man near the aisle, whose lined face spoke of a life filled with both struggle and resilience, exhaled slowly, his fingers curling slightly over his knee, as though grasping something invisible. It was not a moment of spectacle. It was not grand or theatrical. And yet, it was more powerful than any speech Karoline had ever given. Because it was real. She had spent so much of her life crafting words to persuade, to inspire, to guide people toward beliefs she held with conviction. Yet here, in this unassuming room filled with people who had come seeking something far different than what they had received, she realized something profound. Faith was not found in perfect explanations or carefully structured arguments. It was found in the spaces between words, in the quiet courage of a child's question, in the way hearts recognized truth before the mind could even process it. She let her gaze sweep across the room, acknowledging not just the girl, but everyone who had been moved in ways they might not even fully understand yet. "There are things we may never fully know," she continued, her voice carrying the steadiness of someone who had learned this lesson through experience. "But there is beauty in believing anyway, in trusting that even in the moments where we feel lost, we are never truly alone." The girl gave the smallest of nods, her fingers finally loosening their grip on the Bible, as if she had found something more solid to hold on to, something that did not require proof, only trust. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, soft yet certain, like the final note of a song that lingers long after the music has stopped. It was not applause, nor was it the restless movement of an audience eager to return to the ordinary rhythm of their day. It was something deeper, something that would stay with them long after they left this hall, long after Karoline had stepped away from the podium, long after the echoes of her words had faded. She could feel it, the way a moment like this did not simply end. It lived on, carried quietly in the hearts of those who had been present. As she took one last look at the young girl, She knew that this was not just a moment for the child. It was not just a moment for the audience. It had been a moment for her, too. Because sometimes the answers we give to others are the very answers we ourselves have been waiting to find. And in that, she found peace.